They called him Sporus. He had no surname, no legacy, and no protection. Just a name that was soft, short, and easy for an emperor to whisper. The first time Nero saw him, the boy was 15, maybe 16. No one knew exactly. He was the child of a freedman, a quiet boy with wide, dark eyes and a slender face that reminded Rome of something delicate, something easy to break. And Nero, emperor of Rome, the self-proclaimed god in human flesh, liked things that could be broken. Nero watched him during a banquet, watched the way he stood in the shadows, trying to make himself invisible. Perhaps he reminded Nero of someone who was no longer alive to defy him, his dead wife. But here's the thing that makes this story even more twisted. After Nero died, Sporus didn't get his freedom back. Instead, he became a political pawn, passed around between emperors like a broken toy. 3 different rulers used him for their own purposes before his story reached its inevitable, tragic end. Fair warning, this gets dark. Really dark. The Empress Poppaea Sabina had been dead for months. Some said she died in childbirth. Others said Nero kicked her stomach in a rage until she stopped moving. What mattered was that she was gone, and the emperor wanted her back. When Nero's gaze fell on Sporus, it did not carry curiosity. The boy was summoned the next morning with no explanation. Just the cold announcement of what would be done. He would be castrated. There was no trial, no discussion with his family, just the order, because Nero wanted a replacement, a body to mold into the image of the dead empress. Sporus was dragged into the imperial quarters, held down on a slab of polished stone, and cut. His voice tore through the hallways, high, thin, and desperate. Some servants covered their ears. Others watched, numb. It was said the physician worked quickly, efficiently. When it was over, the boy lay there trembling, covered in his own blood. Something inside him had been stolen, something he could never name or reclaim. Nero called for him again weeks later. Sporus was cleaned, perfumed, dressed in silk robes dyed the color of pomegranate. A golden net was placed in his hair. No one dared to meet his eyes as he was led to the emperor's chambers. Nero looked him over slowly, not as a human being, but as a project, as proof that if he willed it, the dead could be made to live again. He named Sporus Sabina. He said the boy would be his wife. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. They staged a wedding, not in secret, but in front of Rome. Senators, generals, nobles, they were all ordered to attend. It was a performance more than a ceremony. The boy walked down an aisle strewn with rose petals. His skin was powdered. His hair was coiled and pinned in the style of an empress. A veil hid most of his face, but no veil could hide the emptiness in his eyes. Nero took Sporus's hand, lifted it before the crowd, and announced that Poppaea had returned to him, that the gods had given him back what death had stolen. Some guests applauded. Others kept their hands folded, eyes down, trying to pretend this was not an abomination. But everyone watched. Everyone remembered. That night, in the emperor's bed, the boy became something else. Nero called him by his dead wife's name again and again, even as Sporus flinched at each repetition. He was not Poppaea. He was not Sabina. He was nothing, and Nero liked it that way. Rome whispered about them. They whispered about the boy who had no future, no manhood, no escape. They whispered about the emperor who demanded that everyone accept the lie, that this child was an empress reborn. Sporus was paraded through the streets in a litter draped in imperial purple. Nero forced dignitaries to bow to him as though he truly sat beside a goddess. He dressed Sporus in jewels so heavy they bruised his collarbones. He made him recite the words Poppaea once spoke, lines the boy learned by heart because he had no choice. In public, Nero smiled. He showed off his living doll. In private, the reality was simpler and uglier. Sporus was a hostage to a memory he had never shared. Every morning, he was reminded of what had been cut away, and every night he was reminded of what he would never be. But here's what makes it even more twisted. Nero genuinely seemed to believe his own fantasy. He would introduce Sporus to foreign ambassadors as his wife. He'd talk about their relationship as if it were a normal marriage. He'd even get jealous if other men paid too much attention to his wife. The psychological pressure on Sporus must have been unbearable. He was living a complete lie, forced to pretend to be someone he wasn't, trapped in a body that had been surgically altered to satisfy another man's obsession. Every day was an act, every moment a performance that he couldn't escape. The Empire watched and said nothing, because Nero was emperor, and emperors could do as they pleased. Sporus learned to stay silent. It was the only way to survive. He spoke only when spoken to. He moved only when summoned. His face never showed disgust, never betrayed the sick churn in his stomach when Nero's hand closed around his arm. He had become an expert in pretending. At first, he thought there would be limits. Even Nero, mad as he was, had to obey the shape of the world, the expectations of the Senate, the fear of revolt. But as the months passed, Sporus discovered there were no limits. The daily routine was a nightmare of performance and pretense. Sporus would wake up early to begin the lengthy process of applying makeup, styling his hair, and selecting the appropriate feminine attire for the day. Every detail had to be perfect, because Nero would inspect his appearance and fly into rages if anything seemed off. During public appearances, Sporus had to play the role of devoted wife. He'd sit beside Nero at state dinners, smile prettily during gladiator games, and make small talk with visiting dignitaries who were clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Everyone knew what he really was, but they all had to pretend otherwise. The sexual aspect of their relationship was probably the most traumatic part of Sporus' daily life. Nero didn't just want a feminized companion. He wanted to recreate his sexual relationship with Poppaea, using Sporus' modified body as a substitute. The boy had no choice but to submit to whatever the emperor demanded. But it wasn't just about sex. Nero was obsessed with recreating every aspect of his relationship with his dead wife. He'd have long conversations with Sporus, probably expecting responses that matched his memories of Poppaea. He'd give gifts that were meant to echo presents he'd given to his first wife. He'd even reenact romantic moments from their marriage. The isolation was crushing. Sporus couldn't form real friendships because everyone around him was either terrified of Nero or trying to curry favor with the emperor. He couldn't confide in anyone because expressing any dissatisfaction with his situation would be seen as treason. He was surrounded by people but completely alone. The physical discomfort was constant too. The tight clothing, the heavy makeup, the elaborate hairstyles, all of it designed to maintain an illusion rather than provide comfort. His castrated body was dealing with hormonal changes and healing from surgery, but he couldn't show any signs of pain or discomfort because that would break the fantasy. When the Great Fire swept through Rome, Nero watched the city burn from a private tower, singing verses he claimed he'd composed. Hundreds died screaming in the alleys. Families choked on smoke and threw themselves into the Tiber to escape the flames. While the embers still glowed red, Nero ordered Sporus to sit beside him, dressed in Poppaea's finest robes, and admire the spectacle. Sporus did as he was told. He sat perfectly still while the air reeked of burned flesh. While survivors crawled in the streets, Nero laid a hand on his thigh and whispered that it was destiny, that it was the cleansing of Rome, the rebirth of greatness. After the fire, the emperor needed someone to blame. He chose the Christians. Sporus was forced to watch as men and women were nailed to crosses, smeared with pitch, and set alight as living torches. Nero called it justice. He called it entertainment. Sporus called it something else. It was hell. The emperor's mind deteriorated further. He trusted no one. Every senator, every general, every advisor was a potential conspirator. Sporus was one of the few he did not accuse, because Sporus was not a rival. He was property, and property did not scheme. On the nights when Nero drank until dawn, He would drag Sporus onto his lap and demand the same questions. Do you love me? Are you happy I saved you? Will you stay forever? The boy answered yes each time. He had learned that lies were safer than truth. He had learned that sometimes survival meant becoming exactly what your captor wanted, and Nero wanted Poppaea, even if he had to carve her out of someone else's flesh. As rebellion smoldered at the empire's edges, Sporus remained at the emperor's side. Armies deserted. Governors declared open defiance. Nero insisted it would pass, that his divinity could not be challenged. But each morning, fewer messages came. Fewer allies answered. The end began as all endings do, with whispers. Rumor said the Senate was preparing to strip Nero of his titles, that the Praetorian Guard had been bribed to betray him, that the emperor's death warrant was already written. When Nero finally realized it was true, he did not react like a god. He reacted like a cornered animal. He packed what treasures he could carry, summoned for Sporus and a handful of loyal freedmen, and fled the palace under cover of night. They hid in the villa of a servant. The emperor who once ruled everything was now crouched in a dusty storeroom, shivering in a ragged cloak. And still, he demanded Sporus stay close. He kissed the boy's forehead and called him my Sabina. He swore that together they would escape to the east, that he would make a new empire, with Sporus as his empress. But no ships came, no legions arrived. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of Rome. The Praetorians turned. The city that once knelt for him now hunted him like a stray dog. In the dawn light, soldiers approached the villa. Their footsteps were heavy, final. Nero pressed a dagger into Sporus's hand. His voice was soft, almost pleading. If they take me alive, he said, you must help me die. Sporus said nothing. He did not know how to hold a blade. He did not know how to end a life, even one as monstrous as Nero's. When the soldiers came to the door, Nero panicked. He wept, shaking uncontrollably. He begged for someone, anyone, to help him finish it. In the end, it was a freedman who held the dagger steady while Nero forced it into his own throat. His final words were not curses nor prayers. They were a question, mouthed to Sporus with wide, terrified eyes. What an artist dies in me. Then he fell, and the empire exhaled. Sporus stood over the corpse of the only man who had ever claimed to love him. He felt nothing, no relief, no grief, no freedom, only emptiness. The soldiers stepped past him as though he were invisible. They took the body away. They burned what Nero had left behind. Sporus remained, not as an empress, not as a wife, just as the boy who had survived Rome's worst monster. When Nero died, Sporus probably thought his nightmare was over. Finally, after years of torture and psychological manipulation, he would be free to reclaim his identity and try to rebuild some kind of normal life. He was dead wrong. The problem was that Sporus had become too famous, too recognizable, too valuable as a political symbol. Everyone in Rome knew who he was and what he represented. He couldn't just disappear into the crowd and start over, because his face was known throughout the empire. The new emperor, Galba, inherited all of Nero's property, including his human possessions, and Sporus, despite everything he'd endured, was still considered property. His freedom wasn't even a consideration. Galba looked at this feminized boy and saw opportunity. Not sexual opportunity, but political opportunity. Sporus represented Nero's excesses, his cruelty, his disconnection from Roman values. Keeping him around was a way to remind everyone of the previous emperor's failures, but Galba's reign was short and bloody. Within months, he was assassinated by his own supporters, and power passed to Otho, another ambitious general who thought he could do better. Otho had a different idea about what to do with Sporus. Instead of using him as a symbol of Nero's failures, Otho decided to use him as a connection to Nero's legitimacy. After all, Sporus had been the previous emperor's wife. Marrying him might transfer some of that imperial authority. so Sporus found himself married again, this time to a man who saw him as a political tool rather than an object of obsession. It wasn't love, it wasn't even lust. It was cold calculation, and in some ways, that was even more dehumanizing than Nero's twisted passion. Otho's reign lasted about 3 months before he too was dead, killed in battle against yet another claimant to the imperial throne. The civil wars that followed Nero's death were turning the Roman Empire into a blood-soaked game of musical chairs, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. Each time power changed hands, Sporus found himself inherited like a piece of furniture. He had no say in his fate, no control over his circumstances, no ability to escape the cycle of exploitation that had begun under Nero. The third emperor to claim ownership of Sporus was Vitellius, a glutton and drunk who had fought his way to power through sheer brutality. Vitellius looked at this feminized boy and saw something different than his predecessors had seen. He saw entertainment. Vitellius decided that Sporus would make an excellent addition to his gladiatorial games, not as a fighter, obviously, but as a spectacle. He planned to dress the boy up as a woman and have him reenact Nero's death in the arena, probably as a form of public humiliations and political theater. The irony was bitter. Sporus had been created to satisfy one emperor's delusion, used as a political symbol by another, married off for legitimacy by a third, and now he was going to be turned into a circus act for the entertainment of the masses. But this was where Sporus finally drew the line. After years of submission, years of playing whatever role was demanded of him, years of being treated like an object rather than a human being, something inside him finally snapped. He couldn't take any more degradation, any more humiliation, any more of being used by powerful men for their own purposes. The exact details of what happened next varied depending on which historical source you read, but the outcome was the same. Rather than participate in Vitellius's twisted entertainment, Sporus chose to end his own suffering. In the quiet hours before dawn, he found a blade, not as long as the dagger Nero had used, but sharp enough. He sat on the cold floor. He looked at his reflection in a polished bowl, at the hollow cheeks, the haunted eyes, the scar that marked where he had been cut all those years ago, and he opened his veins. No attendants came running. No one shouted in alarm. When they found him, the blood was dry. His body was pale, almost peaceful. In death, he was neither boy nor wife, neither emperor's treasure nor emperor's shame, just Sporus, a name at last that belonged only to him. Rome moved on. New emperors rose. New wars raged. New scandals erupted. But in the shadows of those marble palaces, servants still whispered about the castrated boy, the living doll. They whispered that he was the proof of what power could do, how it could twist love into something monstrous, how it could take a child and turn him into a prop for madness, how it could make the entire world watch and do nothing. Some stories are too shameful for monuments, too cruel for memory, too human to forget. This was one of them. The boy who never had a choice, the emperor who never had a conscience, and a love story that was never love at all. Now, click on the next video coming on the screen right now to keep watching. If you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, go to the comment section and mention any other horrific parts of history you want us to make a video on.